Tuesday night, so Q&A night. So a few questions tonight. First one that's come in. I don't know how to tell my mother, who is 80 years old, not to overly obsess about getting father's inheritance. He's still alive at 84. She has been complaining and wanting to get more for several years, and still complains every time when we talk. However, she is already very wealthy herself. Well, the reality is we don't know when we're going to die. Death is uncertain. We will die for sure, but when, we don't know. So it's always possible that your mother could actually die before your father. Probably the statistics tell us that men die first, but it's not always the case. So maybe your mother will never actually receive any inheritance if she dies first. So that's the one first thing, isn't it? The uncertainty of life and these kind of issues. We just don't know. So anything that will help your mum to develop more introspection, turning her attention inwards to look for some inner peace and understanding that comes through the Dhamma, through spiritual practice, meditation, listening to Dhamma, reflecting on the Dhamma, being more mindful will help. Because then the more we turn our attention inwards to look for inner peace and happiness, then the less we are concerned with wealth and things on the outside. Because of course when you die you can't take anything with you anyway, it's all very temporary. But that desire, it's craving, isn't it? Maybe build up over a lifetime. If your mum and dad have lived together, then they've invested time and energy building up the family, building up their wealth. So unfortunately when that happens and we're not very mindful, we begin to cling or attach to our wealth, our spouse's wealth. We feel we're entitled to it maybe. So trying to get her to see the impermanence of these things, that there's more to life than wealth or even the expectation of wealth, say from your father. Try to help your mum reflect on some of the good things she's done in her life. Her dana, generosity that she's practiced, sila. If she's lived in a more moral way, generally hasn't harmed people, there's many things that she can rejoice in that are totally independent of the idea of material wealth. So this is something the Buddha encouraged us to do, to recollect our generosity that we've practiced in the family, in society, supporting the religion if she's ever done that. Recollect our precepts, recollect the goodness of her life. More and more, then wealth doesn't seem so important. Or you can be creative around these things. Maybe talk to your mum about her will. What's she going to do with her wealth when she dies? Who's she going to give it to? Maybe she could start giving it away before she's dead. Practicing dana with the family, giving to her children or other members of the family, giving away to society, to good causes. We can practice dana before we die. And so if she's practicing dana, then the thought of clinging to her husband's wealth will be less important. Whatever you can do to get her to think in this way, so maybe listening to Dhamma will help, if you can get her to hear Dhamma teachings about impermanence, letting go, the joy of generosity, helping others, practicing compassion. There's plenty of areas for your mum to look into. And you can help maybe through talking to her, bringing the Dhamma to her. The last resort is the scaring people. So occasionally Buddhists scare each other, so when somebody is too attached to wealth or the thought of wealth, I want this wealth from this person who's going to die, when am I going to get it? You talk about how if they die they might become a hungry ghost, a peta, because of their obsession with wealth that tends to lead to a lot of clinging. So when they die, the clinging keeps their consciousness in an unhappy destination. They can't be reborn in a good destination yet because they're overly attached to wealth. And that's suffering, isn't it? And you don't want to be reborn as a ghost floating around. So look at the suffering of clinging, craving and clinging. It's not a state of peace, contentment. If you're able to talk to your mum in this way, just to get her to reflect on her own state of mind and say, well, there's actually more happiness and peace in letting go than in clinging. There's a number of different angles you can approach it. It's that story of the businessman who earned lots of money in his life, became a politician and a businessman, had all this money, and then he came to see Ajahn Chah and said, I'm getting to the end of my life now, I want to start divesting, getting rid of some of my wealth, but I want to do it in a good way. And he was hoping Ajahn Chah would suggest some kind of project that Ajahn Chah would be involved with, and he could offer his money to Ajahn Chah. And people like to do that sometimes with famous teachers. They get a lot of credit and feel good, and other people praise them. So it's quite an attractive option if you've got some money to make a donation in that way. But Ajahn Chah was somebody who was very unattached to wealth and money and uninterested, and could see the suffering of clinging. So when this man was talking to him, he didn't go with his ideas and his plans of doing some charitable project with this money. He talked in a totally different way. He just said, well, when you came to the monastery, you came out of Ubon city. Ubon city is bordered by a river, the Moon River, and you drive over it along a bridge coming towards Ajahn Chah's monastery. He said, when you came out of Ubon in your car, you drove over the Moon River, didn't you? And the man said, yep. So Ajahn Chah said, well, look, when you go back home today in your car, when you reach the bridge over the Moon River, stop and get all that money, however many millions, however much wealth you've got, get all that money and just throw it over the bridge. So that was Ajahn Chah's suggestion, just giving a very clear-cut teaching of non-attachment, because our ultimate happiness is not in wealth, it's in letting go of attachment. And if that's what's required, sometimes you have to do it. That's one way. Even doing dana can be a burden, can't it? Because you've got to think about that wealth and what you're going to do with it, how you're going to spend it, how you're going to manage it. So even charity can be a kind of suffering. So there's many angles to this one you can think of. There's another question. Dear Ajan, with just 2 weeks until the end of Vasa, I'm trying to put extra effort into the practice of restraint, especially around food and sleep. However, I find it very hard to be strict with myself. E.g., this morning I got up at the agreed time, then after meditating for an hour I became tired, and instead of arousing more energy, I curled up and had a nap. Oops. I guess the defilements are walking all over my heart. Is it good just to start small and try to make little victories against Mara? Thank you. Well, you don't have to just do little victories, you can do big victories. You can always try. This is why Ajahn Chah used to have morning meetings, 3 a.m. wake-up bell, and you come out to the hall, and the morning wake-up bell is like one of the most feared sounds in the monastery, because it's something that's compulsory. You have to get up, go to the hall, do the morning meditation and chanting, and sometimes you're up for it, sometimes you're not, especially if you've been up late the night before or been doing a lot the day before, then you don't want to get up at 3 a.m. I remember when I'd hear that bell, sometimes I'd think, how on earth can it be so quick? You put your head down to sleep, and it seemed like 5 minutes later there's the wake-up bell. It seemed like 5 minutes, not 4 or 5 hours. So you'd complain and say, how can this morning wake-up bell be so quick? Well, Ajahn Chah used to say, just get up. Whether it's you wake up naturally or you hear the bell, just get up. And just make that your habit. And don't think twice about it. Don't decide to get up, because you sit there deciding, you'll convince yourself to carry on sleeping. Roll over, especially in the cold. It's colder in Australia than it is in Thailand. So don't give your mind a chance to talk yourself out of it. Just get up. So there's other reflections that help you. Think about death. If you lie there, you might die where you're sleeping. And people regularly die. One of the most common times of day that people die is just before dawn or around dawn. So if you stay there sleeping, maybe you'll die where you are. And you've missed your chance to meditate and practice. So just get up and start practicing. Go to the meeting if you have a group meeting, or just go out of your kuti or your room. Even if there's no group meeting scheduled, you can still go to a meditation hall or a place. If you're in a house or home, go to another room and sit and do your practice. That can help. And then when you're tired and you want to nap, get up and do walking meditation. Walking meditation is one of the best cures for sleepiness and laziness. So you've sat for an appropriate period of time. If you're becoming really sleepy, get up and do walking. Even indoors you can do very slow walking. Outdoors you can walk as fast and energetically as you like to wake up. And, we can do many other things. If we have to travel, we can stay awake. If we have some job to do or some interesting thing, then you can stay awake. So why can't you stay awake to meditate? Sit and walk meditation, which is even more it's better for you than all these other things. In Australia, the time is different from the rest of the world. So you always hear people say, "Oh, I got up this morning at 4 a.m. to watch my soccer or my this, my that," because it's going on in some other part of the world. People will do that. They'll get up early for a sport event or some kind of entertainment. Why can't we get up for meditation? So one of the qualities you need is adhitthana, parami, resolution. Make your resolution. before you go to sleep. I'm going to get up at whatever time you establish in your mind and program your mind, and then when the time comes, you just get up. Doesn't mean to say you can't have a good rest, so you decide what is the right amount for you, but then make your resolution what time you're going to get up, and then maybe you need to have a second resolution. Once you're up, you're not going to go back to sleep, if that's what's needed. Then you have Satya Bharami, you've got your resolution, and then you stick to it. You're honest and you stick to it. You don't cheat, you don't follow the excuses and go back to sleep. Then you need virya, effort, energy. You need metta because what you're doing is good for you. You're training, developing mindfulness even when you feel tired or lazy. It's good for you. So that's metta. And metta we practice in different ways. And sometimes metta means doing something that's good for you, but you don't want to do. And you need upekkha bharami because you have a grumbling mind saying, I'm feeling tired, my body's tired, I don't want to get up. But you practice upekkha, meaning your equanimity towards the painful or unpleasant feelings, towards the grumbling mind, towards the cold weather or whatever it is that you don't like about the morning. Another way is also use wisdom and just try and use your panya bharami and see maybe there's something good about what you're doing. Maybe, I used to like getting up in the morning in Thailand, even though sometimes you're tired, because it's a quiet time of day. You get up early, no one else is bothering you, the world is quiet, peaceful. It's quite a magical kind of time of day. So try and appreciate the good in something, what you're doing, or what are the rewards of getting up early. So remind yourself or motivate yourself. So there's a few different bharamis you can employ and reflect on. Same with food, we have to learn how to eat the right amount of food. So again, you can make practices, resolutions. One Ajahn used to encourage is counting your mouthfuls of food. So you get to know how much food you need for a day, however many mouthfuls. I knew one monk for his whole life, he just ate 32 mouthfuls of food a day from the 32 parts of the body, and he was really skinny. But that was his practice, and he stuck to it very diligently. But you don't have to become that thin. You could 50 mouthfuls, 60 mouthfuls, whatever the number is, but then you stick to your mouthfuls and you become mindful of how many mouthfuls of food you eat. Or the other one, Ajahn used to say, if you're filling up, then the last 5 mouthfuls you don't actually eat and you drink some water to fill up. Or you can make resolutions around what kind of food you take. So it's not just the amount, but also certain foods you're really obsessed with, addicted to, love. Maybe you cut them out and just take the more ordinary food that doesn't arouse desire. People do different things. Some people take just rice, some people take no sweets or no salads or whatever it is that you like. You may cut that out of your diet to teach you to let go of certain things. There's so many options here. Some monks they give their bowl to another monk and say, you take the food, whatever food you want to put in there, you put in there. They don't even choose their own food. It's another practice you can try. So yes, while you're on retreat, practice restraint with food and sleep. The more effort you put in the long run, you develop good habits, good qualities. And you have to use your opportunity while you have it, because we don't know how long we've got the chance to practice. We can fall ill tomorrow, we could drop dead tomorrow, the world could fall apart tomorrow. We really don't know. Some of the reasons are you can wake up in the morning or get up in the mornings when there's danger. So if you go and stay out in the forest, camping, things moving around, maybe there'll be a snake or some poisonous insects or something that can wake you up. And you don't want to curl up again if there's a chance you might have a snake slither past or something else. I've had a few mornings where I couldn't go back to sleep because monkeys. If you ever stay in a forest with monkeys and they sleep in the tree above you, they'll be really noisy. You won't be able to go back to sleep. So you just give up thinking about going back to sleep with monkeys. It just depends where you are, doesn't it? Maybe if you're staying somewhere. Another monastery I stayed in had, it was right next to Bangkok airport, and it was on the flight path, and there was always one Thai Airways flight that would come over at about 3 a.m. So we called it the wake-up flight. And what it was a Thai Airways flight coming into the airport, but the captains, because they always knew the pilots, they knew the area, they were the local pilot because they were Thai Airways. They would do a shortcut over the monastery. So they'd take this circle, they'd be circling to land, and most flights would circle a bit further out, so they're further away. But this one flight, every morning, he'd always fly over the monastery, and my kuti would actually shiver, would shake with the power of the airplanes, the jet engines. So who needs an alarm clock when you've got a Boeing jet overhead shaking your kuti? So he used to wake us all up. So anyway, you just find things that will wake you up. Or you have an alarm clock and you put it in the corner, and then once the alarm clock goes, you have to get up to go and turn it off, and then you just don't go back to your bed. Stay away from your bed. Another question. What did Ajahn Chah say, or why did Ajahn Chah say that why did Ajahn Chah say that if you haven't shed some tears yet, then you haven't begun to practice? Because I guess he was just pointing out that this practice, if you're sincere, is difficult and testing and challenging, and it can be frustrating, and it can bring you to tears if you're really trying to root out the mental defilements from your citta, from your heart. Greed, anger, delusion, craving, attachment built up over many, many years, lifetimes. Yeah, it's not easy to uproot greed, anger and delusion, so it can bring you to tears. So I think he was just pointing out, if you haven't reached that point of frustration yet, probably a sign that you're still just scratching the surface a bit. You're still on the surface of your citta and the defilements. We read a lot of Dhamma and hear a lot of Dhamma, but actually practicing is different. Practicing is going deep, isn't it? It's going inside. It's a bit like, I don't know, it could be like, if you have, for some reason, you have to, or say you have a cut and they give you stitches, and then they have to take the stitches out, the thread out. Yeah, it hurts, doesn't it? Taking anything out of your body hurts. If you step on a thorn, to pull the thorn out hurts. Maybe makes your eyes water, or for some reason if you had to pull a hair out, it makes your eyes water. Certain things make our eyes water. Uprooting defilements is the same. It can make your eyes water because it's painful and difficult and requires, like the last question, dealing with sleepiness and laziness at first thing in the morning, requires effort, and that effort can bring you to tears sometimes when you're one part of your mind is saying, I want to sleep, and the other part is saying, no, you have to get up and meditate, and you have an argument. It's just like when we were kids and we have our favourite toy, and then somebody takes it away, or you can't play with it anymore because you've got to do something else, you cry. Even when we're adults, we cry sometimes, at least mentally, or at least just get tears forming in the eyes when we're battling with craving, because craving is about wanting, desire, and giving up wanting and desire, because once you've established that that's a cause of suffering, craving is a cause for clinging, which is a cause for becoming, birth, and then all the suffering. Once you've established that, then sometimes to give up craving brings tears to your eyes, because it's hard work. And training yourself is hard. Discipline, consistent or persistent effort is hard. Our mind is stubborn. One of the kilesas, one of the manifestations of our kilesas is stubbornness. We stubbornly cling to our ideas. We stubbornly cling to our wants and desires. We stubbornly cling to our comfort zone. We love comfort and convenience. We stubbornly cling to what we perceive as freedom, when actually that freedom is really a delusion. We stubbornly cling to so many things, so to uproot that clinging and get through that stubbornness can be a little bit painful. Or like when you pull a sticky plaster off a cut and you pull it off, it hurts. You go, oh. Pulling out kilesas is like that. Letting go of anger, when you're really angry with someone and you're letting it go, when you really hate and are really annoyed with that person, but you're also aware that that is a defilement. It's hard work to do that. To lower your conceit and your ego and your arrogance is hard work. So sooner or later in one part of your practice you might well be brought to tears. Maybe just tiredness of working with your mind and practicing mindfulness when your mind is not very mindful. Whatever aspect of the practice it is, sooner or later it can bring you to tears because of your sincerity of effort. And it's not that Ajahn Chah was a sadist wanting everyone to be miserable and suffering and crying, but he was just pointing out from his experience that it can bring you to that point. And not all the time, but occasionally. Last question. Can you please speak about Ajahn Panyawada? So for those of you who don't know Ajahn Panyawada, he was the English monk who was a student, disciple of Ajahn Mahabua. He's one of the most famous meditation masters in modern Thai Buddhist history. Ajahn Panyawada came from England and lived with Ajahn Mahabua for about 41 years in his forest monastery in northeast Thailand. And he wasn't such a well-known meditation teacher, but in the circle of people who knew him, they were always very inspired by his presence, very cool, calm, peaceful presence, and the depth of his wisdom. He's very good at explaining the path of practice from start to finish, all the way to Nibbana, and explaining the way to practice the Buddhist teachings. Very practical, but very coming from a real place of knowledge and understanding, but coupled with this sense of peace. He had a very peaceful mind, a peaceful presence, but at the same time very firm and determined in his practice. So those who lived with him and knew him appreciated his teachings over the years. His life, well, you can find out, you can Google it and get it, his life story, but in brief, He was British, but he was born actually in India. Maybe that's an auspicious fact from his life. He was born in India because his father was a mining engineer in India in the first half of the last century. So I think he was born about 1925. But when he was a child, he was sent to England to not to a boarding school, to his grandparents, to live with his grandparents in Wales. His ancestry is he was from Wales. And he lived with his grandparents, went to school, got an education, and he trained to become an electrical engineer. He had one problem which came up right through his life. He had TB in his foot. His foot became infected when he was young, and there was problems with the bones. They fused together. They had surgery to try and help him. So he always walked with a limp, had some pain and arthritis in later years. That sort of defined him, and he always used to say that helped him because otherwise he would have had to fight in the Second World War. Because he was of that age, he was quite young. Second World War, he was in his around 20 years old, and he would have been called up, but because of his bad foot, he wasn't. So he said that's a good example of how something that's misfortune or bad karma manifesting actually is good fortune, because it keeps you out of the war and you don't make the bad karma of killing people. So he didn't go to the war, and then after the war he got work, I think, in London as an electrical engineer, and he started attending the London Buddhist Society. What brought him to be interested in Buddhism, I'm not sure. I think it was just reading, and he was obviously somebody who was broad, open-minded, and he had a little bit of background from India. He was a very wise, thoughtful person. That was his character. So he liked to think, and so he liked to read and think about what he read, and that brought him to Buddhism. It's brought him to the London Buddhist Society, and he even started to think in terms of ordination. So his first teacher was one of the first English monks, Venerable Kapilawatu. Took him under his wing, and he started to meditate, learn the Dhamma, and eventually he went to, he was ordained as a novice first in London with some others, English people. So he became a novice monk, and then he resided at the Buddhist Society and helped run that place and teach and study. Then eventually he went to Thailand with two others to ordain, and an ordination was arranged at Wat Bak Nam, Pasi Jalern, which is a big temple in Samut Prakan, just south of Bangkok. That was in 1955, I think. And because it was one of the first ordinations of foreign monks in Thailand, it was huge, thousands and thousands, one of the biggest crowds ever for an ordination for these three Englishmen who became monks. So he used to laugh about that because he became a monk to find seclusion and practice meditation, but his actual ordination was massive. I think it was even filmed, which is unusual for the time, 1955. But thousands of people attended, and then he stayed at that monastery, which is the monastery of Lumpur Sot, who was a famous meditation teacher in Thailand. He had a very unique method of meditation, which Ajahn Kalyano didn't quite like or connect with. He didn't find it work for him. It's a meditation method of visualizing internal lights, crystals, Buddhas, a lot of visualization. And he said he didn't really get the point of it. It wasn't explained to him well, or it didn't fit well with what he was reading from the suttas. So he wasn't very happy there. Eventually he went back to England and helped run the Buddhist society there, and the other monks all disrobed. So he was, if I remember, he was running it single-handedly for a few years, about 5 years. Teaching, learning the Dhamma, teaching, meditating. But he said, when you're a Nawaka monk, a junior monk, trying to run a Buddhist centre, it's difficult because you need experience, you need to develop your own practice. So it wasn't very ideal. So he kept developing the wish to go back to Thailand to find a teacher where he could train and practice himself, rather than being the teacher in London, in a house in London, which was, it was a very noble thing he did, and he was that kind of person. He was very sacrificing for others, with a sense of duty, responsibility, kindness and wisdom. So apparently he was still quite a good teacher, even though he was a very junior monk. But he recognized that he needed his own teacher and to further his practice. So eventually he had a friend, a Thai man, and he asked him to find him a teacher. So when he returned to Thailand, he went to stay first of all with Lumpur Panyananda, who was a monk who was quite friendly to foreign monks. I knew him quite well when I was a young monk. He went to stay at Wat Chonbratan on the edge of Bangkok, but he wasn't planning to stay there permanently. He was staying under Lumpur Panyananda's guidance until he could find the teacher. And his lay friend, the Thai man, had gone working in northeast Thailand and got to know many of the forest masters, meditation masters in the Ajahn tradition, the forest tradition. And so this man came to see him and recommended that he go and see Ajahn Mahabua, who was considered one of the foremost meditation teachers of the day. This is in the early 1960s. And Ajahn Mahabua occasionally would come and stay at Wat Bawon, big old Dhammayutta royal temple in Bangkok. So Ajahn Panya, the young Ajahn Panya, went over to see him and asked questions of the Dhamma. I think when he first went to see him, he was still treating his bad foot, and he was in plaster, had a plaster cast. He was getting treatment from doctors. And Ajahn Mahabua took one look at that and said, "Oh, you're never going to be able to live with me at my monastery. My monastery is a forest monastery," and in those days it was pretty simple and basic. So Ajahn Mahabua refused to accept him. But the next time he went to see Ajahn Mahabua, his leg was no longer in plaster cast. So Ajahn Mahabua again refused him. I think the third time, Ajahn Panya, who was quite smart, thought of a way to get round Ajahn Mahabua's refusal. He said, "Can I come and stay with you temporarily?" So he accepted him as a temporary visiting monk, and that became a joke because he stayed there temporarily for 41 years. But he was drawn to Ajahn Mahabua's teaching style. Ajahn Mahabua, as a layman, had been a boxer, very direct character, didn't beat about the bush, very strict disciplinarian in his monastery, very kind, and everyone believed him to be an arahant, but he's very direct speaking. And Ajahn Panya liked that, because he said, practicing Buddhism in London, everybody is just so full of knowledge and views and opinions. You can spend all day talking about the Dhamma but never practicing it. And everybody goes around in circles talking about the philosophy of Buddhism and the background and comparing and arguing over different things. And he found that quite challenging, whereas Ajahn Mahabua was very direct, to the point, teaching him, you need to be disciplined, keep the Vinaya, practice mindfulness, very direct teaching, and he liked that style. It didn't put him off at all, it attracted him to Ajahn Mahabua. So he got permission to go and stay with Ajahn Mahabua at his monastery. And Wat Barbanta in those days, the monastery was very poor and simple, but it was already in that part of Thailand, Udon Thani. There were rice fields all around, so it was like an oasis of forest. It wasn't like deep jungle with lots of tigers and elephants. There were those places in Thailand, but not there. It was just ordinary forest surrounded on the outside by rice fields. But in those days there was no power, no road, so when he went there for the first time he was driven there in a Land Rover and they literally just going over the paddy fields. And in the rainy season the paddy fields would fill up with water, so you couldn't even get a car there in the rainy season, you had to go in and out by boat. So it's a bit different today, there are roads, there's villages and so on, but in those days it was still pretty basic. But he liked that, he was willing to train, he knew he'd have to put up with difficulty, but he thought that would be good for him, for his mental defilements, because Ajahn Mahabua always used to say, if you get too much comfort and convenience in your practice, you get lazy. You become sleepy, fat, eat too much, sleep too much, too comfortable, you don't see your defilements, your attachments. So a bit of discomfort is good for us. So Ajahn Panya liked that. So he stayed with Ajahn Mahabua, and Ajahn Mahabua was very fair to him. He had this bad foot, so he didn't make him go on the long arms round that most of the monks went. He could just go on a short Bindabata arms round to the kitchen every day. When I first met him, that was in the 80s. He was doing that every day. Just walk to the kitchen. So he kept up the rules, but they made allowances for his bad foot. And because he was an engineer, he was very useful to Ajahn Mahabua. He could arrange all kinds of building projects. So he built many of the kutis, the kitchen and other buildings. He built the wall around the monastery. He built the women's section. He did a lot of good work in the monastery. He could fix things because he was an electrical engineer, so he fixed tape recorders and clocks and things, and generally made himself very useful and appreciated. But at the same time, he was very disciplined in his practice. And the monks who lived with him, one thing they said was he was very regular, like clockwork. He was good at fixing clocks, and his own personal routine was like clockwork. So they said he'd always be walking meditation at a certain time, sitting at a certain time. So very regular and disciplined in his practice. He liked to read, so he's well read in Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, so he could speak very well about Buddhism when people had questions, and explain things very well. He could explain the teaching on dependent arising very well. That's one of the subjects I used to like talking to him about. A very clear mind and a very peaceful character. When you never would see him get angry or irritated or upset or stressed about things. And he was quite firm in the way he practiced and the way he dealt with people, because he was, for much of his life, he was the deputy abbot of that monastery, and it was a very big, busy monastery by the end of his life, because Ajahn Mahabua became so famous. But Ajahn Panya was very cool-headed and made good decisions and kept up his practice, and he'd do a lot of translation as well. In his free time, he would translate teachings of Ajahn Mahabua into English. Later, there were other monks who could help as well, but the original translations were much appreciated, because in those days there was very little English Dhamma. So monks like myself and many other monks really appreciated the early translations, because there was so little available. And that led to him in about 1974, I think. They invited him and Ajahn Mahabua to London to teach meditation and look into the possibility of starting a forest monastery in England. Because the Buddhist Society, the English Sangha Trust, they had that aspiration for many years. And they had the property in Hampstead, where Ajahn Sumedho later first went. But in those days, Ajahn Sumedho hadn't yet arrived, so they were hoping Ajahn Panyawada might return to England to start a monastery. But in the end, he returned to Thailand with Ajahn Mahabua, and they decided, for whatever reasons, it wasn't ready, the time wasn't right, or they weren't right. I think partly Ajahn Panyawada said it was his wish to continue his own practice with his teacher. Meant that he never returned to England. That was the one and only time they went to England. So after that, he never returned and just stayed at Wat Babanta. Once or twice he went out of Wat Babanta, the monastery of Ajahn Mahabua, when he was a young monk, to go and stay. A famous time he talked about was in Lopburi, which is central Thailand. He went for a period of time on retreat in some caves there, which he said were very fruitful time for his contemplation, because when you stay in a cave you have very little sense contact, so you can practice sense restraint, mindfulness, contemplating the causes of suffering in his mind, developing stronger samadhi, he said. And he said it was one of the only times he had to deal with some of the dangers of the forest, because there were wild dogs there, which were quite threatening, he said. But after that, later on in his life, and after he came back from England, I don't remember him ever going out of the monastery other than to, say, visit doctor in Bangkok or something like that. He just spent his time at the monastery helping Ajahn Mahabua, translating, organising work projects, and then doing his own meditation. And his presence was greatly appreciated. Gradually more Western monks came to live at Ajahn Mahabua's, and Ajahn Mahabua would give the task of teaching them. A lot of the time he'd give that to Ajahn Panyawada. And because he said he's a reliable teacher, very wise, discerning teacher, good teacher. And monks like myself and many others would go and stay there and chat with him and get some good Dhamma teachings and good example. Just because if you live with a monk who's a good monk, every day you see them, you get a very good teaching, because you're seeing the commitment to the Dhamma practice through body, speech and mind. It's not just you hear one good talk or read one good book, but if you're seeing them with your eyes, you're hearing them with your ears, and just being in their presence every day for weeks, months, years, then you get a very good reflection like that. You get to know someone and then you see them practice over time. It brings up a sense of confidence in their practice, and then that helps you maybe to try harder in your own practice, because you see there are other people who have gained something from the practice. So it helps to bring up your faith and your willingness to practice. So this is what we call Kalyana Mitta. If you have good Kalyana Mitta, good Dhamma friends, that's a huge input, good input into your practice. So over the years, many monks, lay people as well, would go and visit him, and he would give teachings, but he always carried on his practice. It's not like he sort of became a teacher and then stopped meditating, stopped practicing for himself. He always kept up his practice. And they say, one way you can tell whether somebody's really understood the Dhamma or realized the Dhamma is how they die. You have to wait till the end of their life to prove that or see that. But he had a very peaceful death in his 70s. Like the last few years of his life, we quite often visit him from here, and I would say, "Oh, do you want to come over and stay in Australia? It would be good for the monks there." And he'd say, "Yeah, maybe, I'll think about it." He was very good at saying maybe, but you know that he probably would never do it, but at least he said maybe. But he was getting older, and we used to joke we'd say, what are you going to do when Ajahn Mahabua dies? Because when Ajahn Mahabua dies, there's this huge group of monks, lay men, lay women who practice here, and then every day there were thousands of visitors. When he dies, you'll become the abbot, you'll become the senior monk. What are you going to do? And he said, well, maybe I'll go overseas or something. But then the last few years he'd actually say, well, maybe I'll die first. And that's exactly what happened. He ended up dying first. And because he was a builder, he built the cremation platform ready for his teacher, because they thought the teacher would die first. So he had prepared a place to cremate Ajahn Mahabua. He'd built this simple crematorium for his teacher, and then the joke was, well, he ended up being put there himself. His corpse was put there and cremated, and Ajahn Mahabua on the day of his cremation made that joke and said, we built this for me, and he ended up using it. And but before he died, when he was very ill, he had cancer of the colon. He couldn't digest, so gradually he was starving to death, basically. He couldn't eat food anymore, getting weaker and weaker. And he did take medicine, herbal medicine, and doctors did treat him and give him some support. But in the end, he said, he just accepted the illness very peacefully. He didn't make a fuss, didn't ask for any further treatment. He was at the monastery and he just gradually got weaker and weaker, but very peacefully. Kept his sense of humor till the end. So he could hardly speak. He'd be lying down in his kuti, very weak with his from the cancer. And he'd say, nothing ruins a cup of tea more than cancer. Things like that. He'd have his English sense of humor. And he died very peacefully. And I remember the very last thing I heard him saying was the doctors had been pestering him. They wanted to try new treatments on him for his cancer. And they were sitting there, a couple of doctors sitting there with him, and he's kind of lying there very weak. And they're saying, we want to do this for you, we want to do that for you. And he'd say, oh, that sounds good, but maybe, but not today. So he kept pushing them back very gently, very politely. And then the doctors themselves were getting very frustrated because they wanted to help him and that he wasn't interested. So the doctors got so frustrated that in the end they said to him, we want to do this for you, we want to do that for you, but you don't want any of it. What do you want? He just said, I just want peace and quiet. Can you leave? So then the doctors departed and realized that was it. They're not going to get very far with him because he was always very firm, very peaceful, but very firm in what he wanted to do in his practice. And not long after that, he died. We have some of his relics here, some of his bone relics, and I know someone who's got his tooth, and the tooth crystallized. Actually, before he died, his tooth actually turned to crystal, became a relic. And Ajahn Mahabua said, somebody asked him, will Ajahn Panya's bones turn into relics? And he said, they should do. So many people were given little portions of his bones after the cremation, and you've probably seen the pictures or read the stories. On the day of his cremation, there was a beautiful rainbow around the sun, which you can explain as a weather phenomena, but at the same time, it was a blue sky. It was the kind of day there was no clouds and no moisture in the air, so it's not the normal weather. You get rainbow halos around the sun, and yet there was this intense halo around the sun during the cremation as they carried the coffin out to the crematorium, as it was placed there, and then as they lit the fire, this beautiful halo was around the sun. We pointed it out to Ajahn Mahabua, who looked up and he said, this is a sign of someone with barami, good qualities, karmic accumulations, practiced very well through his life. So it's a fitting end to his life, beautiful rainbow as they cremated him. So a very good monk, good life, good monk, good death. You can read his teachings and his life story. You can get it on the web or the book. Was it Uncommon Wisdom? There's very good teachings if you want to read more. And I knew him for about almost 20 years, and a very inspiring monk. Always had something good to say, some good Dhamma to talk about. He didn't talk much about worldly things, but he liked to talk about the Dhamma, and he gave some very good teachings, which I appreciate myself. So, tonight's session ends here. I'll leave it there until next time.